Nation, where we're transitioning to the Archer Reporter. And I've got a really exciting episode here with Chairman Gennady Stolyarov II of the United States Transhumanist Party. And we're going to cross over to him and talk about all the news. There's so much. Wow, it's just a lockdown edition of COVID. There's a lot of news to talk about, so we're going to talk about a lot of that. But before we do that, we're going to have to thank Thrivous. Thanks Thrivous and Lincoln Cannon over there, and Nootropics supplements for your brain. Make sure you check that out. And also, we have a new VPN company that is supporting us, and I just forgot the name of it, but I'll sponsor that. I'll make sure I talk about Ambient. That's right, Ambient. Yeah, Ambient security. I'm signed up to that. It's a really, really good one. And we're going to have the CEO of Ambient on to talk about why cybersecurity and why getting a VPN is really, really important when it comes to cyber initiatives and keeping yourself secure online in the digital age. Now, over to the show. So, Chairman Gennady, it's really good to see you. Haven't seen you in a while since COVID's taken the world on a crazy tour. We've had a crazy time, but there's still the news rolls on, and I think the big news is that Charlie Cam is now running as a forward of the United States Transhumanist Party. Charlie Cam is a very, very solid figure in transhumanism, going right back to essentially his whole life. His background in science in the 90s, growing up, is very solid. Comes from a strong scientific family. He went to many events, 2005 down there in South America, and then he also ran his own events, 2007, including some famous celebrities from Star Trek. All transhumanist related, very, very solid in the transhumanist community, and he's very big into life extension, which is one of the primary drivers of the United States Transhumanist Party, including not just life extension in the here and now, but also talking about cryonics. He's one of the big heavyweights in the cryonics arena, which is very, very encouraging, especially for the transhumanists. So Charlie Cam is a fantastic innovator, leader. He's a transhumanist heavyweight, and now he's at the front. Do you want to update us on this endorsement of Charlie Cam?
Yes, indeed. So, as you've stated, this has been quite an eventful period, not just for the world in general, but for the U.S. Transhumanist Party in particular. And the endorsement of Charlie Cam, I think, comes at quite an opportune time, as during the last 5 months of the 2020 election campaign, we really need to convey to the public what transhumanism stands for. And we really need to emphasize the core ideals and values of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. And Charlie Cam, in my view, is absolutely the best person to do that at this time. You mentioned his extensive history and background in the transhumanist movement. He is completely dedicated to our goals and to their success, and he knows entertainment, he knows media, he knows celebrities. He has put out films that are able to both educate and amuse. The most famous example is I Am the Very Model of a Singularitarian, but there are other films that he did more recently, like the Radical Life Extension film, and he manages to draw in a wider audience. Even since his endorsement was announced, and his endorsement was announced on June 11th, 2020, we've had an uptick in our membership. So now I'm spending a lot of time in the membership database enrolling people, because they are applying in record numbers, it seems to me, based on the rates of people filling out the membership form, people joining the Transhumanist Party Facebook group, which everybody should do, by the way. And I think this is because Charlie Cam is a unifying figure. He is able to appeal to essentially all constituencies within the transhumanist and life extension and futurist communities. I don't know of any person with even a shred of rationality or decency who doesn't like Charlie Cam, because he has a way of relating to everyone. And this is exactly the candidate we need. We live in a very divisive era. And unfortunately, COVID-19 did not bring humans closer together. We wanted it to bring humans closer together. We thought it would motivate a time of great reflection. We thought it would lead people to realize that they had a common enemy in the novel coronavirus. But unfortunately, what it did by putting so much stress and strain on people in their everyday lives and their finances in terms of the uncertainty that they were being faced, it aggravated a lot of the tensions. And those tensions essentially built up like a pressure inside a volcano. And that volcano is beginning to erupt right now, to the great detriment of everybody involved. There's not one side, not one group in any society that is benefiting from the eruption of these tensions. So we need a way to de-escalate the situation. And we need a way to prevent the toxic conflicts within the mainstream from adversely affecting our own community. We need to stay focused on our core goals as transhumanists, which are life extension, the advancement of emerging technologies, mitigating existential risk, pursuing rationality, transcending common human flaws and common political divisions. All of these are themes that the Transhumanist Party has historically strongly emphasized. And it's been unfortunate to see that these mainstream left-right divisions had gradually seeped into our community. We saw it a bit with the 2019 primary, and we were seeing it to some extent as well in the wake of the pandemic. And I think to some extent, this was because the pandemic pushed certain people to the edge. And whereas they might have otherwise been able to take a few steps back and reflect on their activities, they were no longer able to do that for whatever reason. So essentially, the US Transhumanist Party announced a major internal reorganization on June 11th, 2020. This had been in the works over the prior week. But not only did we have Charlie Cam endorsed as our presidential candidate, but also a lot of the officer positions got realigned. And I think for the future, this is going to be an extremely salutary set of changes. So we have a new vice chairman, Arin Vahanian. Arin was formerly the director of marketing, and he did an excellent job in that role, trying to connect with people in the mainstream and with the values of ordinary people, trying to emphasize why everyone should want to live longer. Everyone should want to use technology and medicine for personal enhancement, for improving quality of life, that these shouldn't be controversial or weird or far out notions. And now as vice chairman, he's going to be able to bring more of that perspective and that focus. We finally have a new director of visual art. That position has been vacant for some time, but Art Ramon Garcia has joined us, and he is a talented painter, both with physical media and with digital media. He has strong graphic design skills as well. The content that he's creating is already beginning to be deployed in various applications for the USTP. Tom Ross, whom you've also spoken with, was previously our director of media production, and he's still great at that. but he has a new title, Director of Sentient Rights Advocacy. And I think this is appropriate in this day and age where definitely discussions of rights, discussions of civil rights, making sure that all human beings are treated the way in which they deserve to be treated, that no group of people is marginalized. Those are essential issues right now. And Tom Ross has a strong passion for that. He also has been exploring interactions with AI. So the Uplift AI system that David Kelly and his team was developing was used to interact with Tom Ross, and Tom Ross let it read his book US 6. He also had some interesting dialogues with it, and he really cares about making sure that all sentient entities' rights are respected. And if there's intelligence, if there is self-awareness that is to come for these kinds of entities, that we don't miss it, that we don't inadvertently mistreat them. And he's also very much invested in fighting human trafficking, fighting modern slavery. So these are initiatives that he's going to be spearheading for the USTP. John Carrots, a familiar figure from the 2019 primary campaign, he had stayed on with the USTP. He had taken on an officer role in February of this year. And he has been a very stabilizing, unifying kind of presence. So he is continuing to be a part of our team. His new role is Director of Energy Issues. So that capitalizes on his expertise in that realm. And also energy underpins everything we do. So the very fact that we're able to have this conversation right now relies on a sophisticated energy infrastructure. Indeed, the entire modern world, and certainly the future transhuman era, is going to rely on a wise attainment and use of energy through novel sources. So John Carrots is in a great position to advise us on that. BJ Murphy, who is our longest serving officer other than myself, has a new role, Director of Foreign Relations, and that's in recognition of the work that he did with our Foreign Ambassador program. He originated the concept. He has been processing the applications that have come in, and we've had new applications coming in just today. So this is a successful program. We wanted to give him the ability to focus on that program and grow it. And indeed, this is what he is doing. And we have a new Director of Longevity Outreach. So Charlie Cam used to have that role, but he was promoted to Director of Marketing now that Arin Vahanian was promoted to Vice Chairman. And the new Director of Longevity Outreach is Daniel Yeluashvili. You're familiar with Daniel. He is also an expert on climate change. He was talking to you about carbon capture and sequestration, but he was also spearheading an initiative to get the government of Argentina and the city of Buenos Aires to recognize aging as a disease. And if this initiative is successful, it will be a first in world politics to have a government actually officially classify aging as an illness and recognize that it can be treated. We believe if this initiative succeeds, it will set off a domino effect, and other countries, particularly micronations and countries seeking to attract research investment, are going to be interested in similar declarations, because now it will be a competition to get the best scientists to come over, to get the best technologists to invest in the research infrastructure of that country. So Daniel is going to be focused on that initiative, making sure it comes to fruition. And as the final component of the reorganization, we've realized over the past few months that the task of promoting our content on social media is far too large to be effectively handled by one person or in an ad hoc fashion. So we formed a social media team of 6 individuals who are going to essentially jointly coordinate releases of various announcements, graphics, imagery, the kinds of media that could draw more people to the USTP. Unfortunately, in the haphazard and uncoordinated approach that previously existed, we had some content that was high-minded and other content that was not so much. And I kept telling certain individuals, do not use memes that look like they come from Reddit or 4chan. Do not use the large, blocky white text. Don't make it seem crass or somewhat in poor taste. Make it stand above the fray. Make it the kind of imagery that a child would appreciate or that someone's grandmother would appreciate, but also somebody who is on the cutting edge of research would appreciate. So we want this high-minded, universal type of appeal, and that's what the social media team is going to be able to achieve, because the social media team is comprised of individuals whom I specifically selected because they're eminently reasonable and they have different perspectives in certain issues, but they're able to discuss those perspectives civilly and calmly. And so the goal is anything the social media team produces will be an outcome that everyone can accept. And the USTP historically has been a party that tried to reach the consensus solution. So we would discuss various options. We would evaluate potential strengths, potential drawbacks, and generally we've found that there's more common ground than not. If everyone approaches a particular interaction in a spirit of goodwill and a desire to make a constructive difference, then many areas for constructive progress can be found, whether one is libertarian leaning or techno-progressive or centrist or non-classifiable. We had a lot of discussions internally within the US Transhumanist Party about what role does the USTP serve for the broader community and for the political scene. And the approach that prevailed, in large part because I insisted that it prevail, is the big tent approach. The fact is, we welcome everyone who shares in our core values and our main goals. We don't care if they're conventionally right-wing or conventionally left-wing. We don't care if they're even uninterested in politics altogether. Even though we are a political party, we also want to be a home for people who are interested in innovation, in science and technology in the future. And we've made it clear that we are a diverse, a cosmopolitan, a welcoming organization, that we're not going to have any purges, and that we're not going to impose strict ideological litmus tests. So this is the result. This reorganization, getting a unity candidate at the top of our ticket, getting a group of people in the officer positions who are very much interested in collaboration and pushing our endeavors forward. That is the kind of path that we need to be on as the US Transhumanist Party and as the broader transhumanist community.
Oh, that's very encouraging. And, you know, I encourage people to check out transhumanist-party.org/leadership, and you will see the full list of the people who are in leadership positions in the United States Transhumanist Party that the chairman has so eloquently laid out and explained. There's some good roles, but there's also room for improvement. There could be more directorship ideas that people can come up with if they feel that they have a skill, some sort of skill that isn't being fulfilled there. But no, it's a very interesting array of people, and they're very dedicated to a specific cause. And it's good to see that the United States Transhumanist Party is staying on track and on mission. We had a question here from Luis Araro saying, how many members do we have in the USTP since Charlie Cam's endorsement? I'm not sure if you have those numbers, but that's a question that popped up on the feed.
Yes, let me take a look at that, and I'll be able to at least give you a rough figure based on where matters stand, and I am looking at
And
this.
while you look up those figures, I'd like to tell people who are new to the United States Transhumanist Party, you can look through the Detonation playlist and find. Sorry, what were you talking, sir?
Oh, no, I was just saying I was looking up the number of members, and this is quite good for the past several days. We've had 55 new member signups over the past week. So in total, right now, I would estimate we have about 2,600 members.
Fantastic. That's over that 2000 mark, which was the small goal that we laid out, and now we go for the much larger, ambitious goal. So that's good to hear that those numbers are in the positive. Like I was saying, all of these people, I think every single person that you've mentioned has come on the Detonation show. So if you want a further explanation of who these people are, for example, if you're wondering who Charlie Cam is, Nikolai Fedorov's champion, you just type in Charlie Cam into Google, it will come up. There's an interview there. You can check out all of these people and their interviews and what they've got. Tom Ross, incredible person. John Carrott's plenty of shows with him. So you can check out Detonation and you can check out the interviews there and get a better understanding of who these characters are, what their goals and ambitions are, and as we go towards a more technologically advanced society, especially post-COVID, since all of the money is shifting into the technology arena now, because it's the only industry left standing, you're going to want these type of people to be at the forefront of leadership positions on the corporate side and on the civic side. Through government, if we can, or at least influencing the intellectual arena in that side as we advance further and further into that society. And I think this is going to be really fundamentally important. So to check out these people, for example, Aaron or Pavel or BJ Murphy, Dan Elton, Charlie Cam, David Shoemaker, Brent, Tom, Justin, Daniel Yashvili, they've all been on the show, and more. Chris Manu, a lot of the foreign ambassadors have been on the show. Dr. Chris Manu, they've all been on the show. So check out the playlist. There's hours and hours and hours of content there. They're all unique. They're all very smart. They're diligent. They're well respected. They've all got incredible depth of knowledge, and it's the party you really want to see influencing the intellectual argument into the future, and it would go a long way to alleviate a lot of the sufferings of people at this current time, who are wandering around in the wilderness, wondering what does the future hold, and you can see what happens when you have misguided leadership. It becomes chaotic, and the United States Transhumanist Party does not aim for chaos. It aims for orderly advancement up the tier. So that's very, very encouraging. I myself am back. We've finally been able to set up, and so we're going to be having more shows. We'll have another show tomorrow with we're going to be talking to Malik. We're going to talk about space colonization. I think space is really starting to become even bigger. I think normal people. I think what it is a two-front. We have the technological ability, we have the aspiration, we have the energy, we have the capacity, we have the enthusiasm through characters like Elon Musk, Bezos, and Richard Branson, etc. Also, Donald Trump advocating for expansion into space. The energy and the enthusiasm is there, but also I think through COVID and through spouts of, and we're going to talk about geopolitics. We're going to talk about what's going on in China and India and Taiwan and what's going on in Europe. There's all that, but all those problems are also playing on the back of people's minds that the systems that they put trust in to ensure stability might not be as stable, might not be as strong, might not be as effective as they once thought they were. And I think people are starting to now turn to space outreach for a as a sanctuary, as something that will could eventually save the species from extinction. So it's not only an innovative concept, an exploratory concept, but it's also becoming a Noah's Ark type relationship there. And in desperation, sometimes things will turn out. So I think the space industry is not only advancing on its own because of its novelty. I think we are hitting a point now where it's becoming it's becoming the thing to do. And so I'm very excited to talk more and more about space. Australia's getting a big space industry here. There's lots of space stuff going up around here in Melbourne. So it's very, very exciting. So we're going to be talking a lot more about space as well. But cryonics, that's another one. It's a big one. We're going to be talking a lot about cryonics. Charlie Cam, obviously, very, very good to talk about cryonics with Charlie Cam and the different cryonics institutions, etc. Jose Cordero, both cryonics and space, being part of the United Nations, knows a lot about that. Very excited to talk more with him on these issues. And it's just going to be an extremely exciting time. Also, socially and economically, UBI is becoming a non-question. I think people are, even the most ardent conservatives, even the most ardent social. I mean, everybody is starting to realize that you can't have a functioning society without some sort of UBI, and I think this is something we want to get economists to talk about. In the positive or the negative, but I'm finding less and less people on both sides of the coin. Because everybody has something to make. People are looking at the social instability that generates from having income inequality, and that actually ends up costing rich and poor alike, especially when there's a pandemic like COVID. If you can't self-isolate, if you don't have somewhere to go home, that just exposes everybody to a disease that at the current rate we cannot control. And with biological weapons coming around where you could launch your own biological weapon from your own backyard, rich and poor alike are starting to realize that not having the flexibility to control population dynamics in the event of a biological disease, using something like UBI is extremely dangerous. And so I think UBI is becoming more of a security issue. It's becoming more of an issue for the safety and security of all classes of society, all tiers of society. So UBI is becoming a non-point. But how do we get to that is a whole nother, and at what pace, in what countries, etc., is becoming a really big talking point. The divergence in health and security. I mean, we talk about like what happened with Sweden with COVID, for example. They didn't go into lockdown. They have a robust public health system that enabled them to stay open as a country and not take some of the economic hits, but they are paying for it now in a little way. But what lessons can we learn from a country like Sweden in terms of their robust public health policies through COVID? Because I think COVID is one of the very interesting, great reflection, but it's very interesting. It really exposed, it really magnified, it really put a light. It's really showed up all the different structural elements of society and how society really works. And even people who didn't see it before because they were busy living their own lives, now you were forced to look at it because you were forced into the framework of how every single country worked, especially when the borders shut, because now you couldn't blame anybody else but your own management of your own systems. So I think post-COVID, we get a global awakening on structural issues, on economics, on healthcare, on finance, on science, and it's going to be a really, really exciting time if you're positive. And if you have ideas to help manage global networks, global systems, global organizations, to generate solutions to navigate us into a better world. And I think the better world is coming because every single the government is leveraged up fiscally. They've taken on a lot of debt, a lot more debt now, which they were screaming out for, which is what we've been talking about on Debt Nation. The Federal Reserves, the central banks of the world have been screaming at the governments to accelerate their debt capacity and open the fiscal coffers, which has now happened, and that's what and it's the management of that fiscal spending which is really exciting, actually, looking at it from a Keynesian perspective, because although I'm not a Keynesian, this is the system that they're running with, and they've been avoiding their own system, and now it's actually starting to come true. So it's quite exciting in that way. But we need people like the great officers here at the USTP, or you out there in the comments, or others, to jump on board and to do what they can to offer up their own research, their own solutions. And just going back on what you said, Chairman Gennady, on this question on aging as a disease, and you rushed in and you said that there will be competition generated between countries to classify this and to get those research dollars. And I was going to say the same thing. I've seen a tipping point where before the fiscal enlargement, this was a burden, because this would be generic across the board. It would be a huge burden to society. It would be expense. We have now crossed a tipping point where the amount of money that can flow into this area through grants, through research grants, because of COVID, because governments want to start preparing against biological diseases, against pandemics, against aging itself as essentially a pandemic. You are looking at now a tipping point where there is going to be competitions between companies, between individual actors, and between sovereign states in order to get this research, not just for the sake of defeating aging, but for the sake of curing all these other diseases, so that they can focus on security issues such as pandemics, the cold, the flu, the whatever, and buffering against those future issues. I think this is absolutely something that's baked into the cake now. I think it was something that could be ignored because we haven't had an influence like this since the influenza. The Black Death is not really in the back of people's minds. People don't really think about that. It happened. It killed a huge population of European history, but it's something you don't really know about unless you're a historian or a policy wonk somewhere. The Antonine Plague, people don't know about that. People don't care about that. People don't think about Stone Age diseases. A lot of those were wiped away and essentially wiped out of this discussion. But I think with COVID now, I think it's brought health and disease and human health back onto the forefront. And I think people are going to do whatever they can in order to buffer against the social, the economic, the political, well, at least those three instabilities that these sorts of biological problems can cause. And we've seen the sorts of instabilities that these can cause, and they're great, and they're horrible, but at the same time, they offer us a great opportunity to promoting human health and the competition mechanism for promoting human health to buffer against future problems. And I'm very excited to see, and I think we will see. I think you'll see smaller countries, exactly like you said, microstates, but we could see larger countries as well. Maybe not somewhere like China, but definitely on the agenda of somewhere like Canada, somewhere like Sweden, Norway, any of the Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, arguably somewhere like Italy, even though it's a large country, they might be something like that. Yes, I'm optimistic that this might happen, and also you might be surprised. It might come from somewhere like Singapore or Dubai, Abu Dhabi, etc. These might also lean towards these areas in order to generate these research agreements. And I'm not optimistic about South America, only because of what I've heard from Dr. Manu. I think that they have many economic and social issues to sort out, especially with the Maduro regime and the problems there in Colombia and Ecuador, massively suffering there in Ecuador. Argentina, maybe. But at the same time, I think we can look forward with a vision, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, maybe some of these microstates, that the competition mechanism to buffer against other issues has begun, and it began with COVID, and it's racing ahead. What would you say on that?
Yes, well, there are so many interesting areas that you mentioned, Steele. In fact, it reminds me of the so-called Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And I think it's quite apropos that we are living in interesting times right now. It does offer a lot of opportunities. It does offer a lot of possibilities for life to be much different in the coming years from what it has been historically. So let me address some of these areas in turn. Space is an area that I would like to discuss first for several reasons. You mentioned you're going to have a conversation with Malak Trabelsi-Loeb. I just spoke with her earlier today at a webinar hosted by our friend, Dr. Osnakachi Kalu, and I was the moderator for that webinar. She gave a presentation, and she also asked questions of our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker. But I mention this because she's going to be one of our guests of honor tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific time, that's Sunday, June 21st, at the U.S. Transhumanist Party's 7th Virtual Enlightenment Salon, where we're going to be discussing how to grow the transhumanist movement, how to reach new demographics, how different countries around the world are situated in terms of public awareness of transhumanism, public reception of transhumanism, how to overcome gender disparities within the movement. And she will be joined by Denise Renson, Arya Chang, and Pam Keefe, 3 of our USTP foreign ambassadors. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Malak Trabelsi-Loeb, of course, is an expert in international space law, and she's very much interested in seeing this multiplanetary future. And I do agree with you. Tremendous steps in that direction have been taken. They've been largely overlooked in the mainstream media because of this heavy focus on the pandemic and the recent riots. But the fact is, the SpaceX launch of Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken to the International Space Station is the most hopeful news of 2020 thus far. And I think it's going to be a lot more historic in its significance than any of these events on the ground right now, because this is the dawn of an age of much lower cost private space travel. Ultimately, the government space programs starting in the 1950s did achieve a lot in terms of setting new precedents, showing what is possible, but they were always extremely expensive and hyper bureaucratized. They were anchored to the earth, essentially literally, by special interest pressures, by the fact that in order to assemble a space shuttle, you had to navigate through a cumbersome political process where you needed to give each contractor from each politically connected district its due in order to manufacture this extremely expensive machine that still had various technical flaws because it was built on political considerations rather than purely scientific considerations. In 1986, after the Challenger incident, the great physicist Richard Feynman was asked to head a commission to investigate that. And he found essentially the systemic incentive problems within that bureaucracy that led to a failure of proper safety controls. Now, on the other hand, you look at Elon Musk, you look at someone who's willing to have rockets blow up, but not with people in them. You're looking at someone who's willing to experiment and iterate many, many times over. But when it comes to the actual time that it matters, the proof of concept that's going to go down in the history books. He wants to make sure that it is absolutely right down to the tiniest detail. And he has been like that with the Tesla vehicles. He has been like that with his various other infrastructure projects. So it's no surprise that Elon Musk has this kind of disposition and that he will avoid the kinds of failures that plagued the space shuttle program and ultimately turned the public and politicians away from it toward the sorry state of affairs that lasted for 9 years, when the United States did not have the capability of launching humans into orbit from American soil. Now, that was quite a way to fall for a country that was the first to send a man to the moon in 1969, which is now 51 years ago. That country did not have the capability to launch humans into the orbit of Earth up until this year. So with this SpaceX launch, that downward trajectory has been reversed finally. And we're going to see more private entities enter the field. We're going to see more from Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin. And surely this will motivate other countries' space programs to compete. As the costs come down, government programs are also going to benefit because a lot of the components and a lot of the technical know-how will be in reach of smaller budgets. So we actually want the intermediate powers to have the ability to launch rockets into space as well. We want an industry to develop in space. We want asteroid mining. We want people to settle the moon. We want people to launch expeditions to Mars to begin terraforming it. All of this now, I think, is conceivable within the next few decades. So this is what I have to say on the area of space. Now, on the treatment of aging as a disease, we have an opportunity here with the COVID-19 pandemic because of essentially the elephant in the room. A lot of life extensionists realize this. You've heard this from Aubrey de Grey, you've heard this from Brent Nally, you've heard this from Maria Intrigus Abramson. They all point to the fact that mortality rates are overwhelmingly higher among the elderly. The median age of death from COVID-19 is somewhere in the 80s. And on the other hand, younger people, they can suffer from the disease, especially if they have underlying pre-existing conditions or they're immunocompromised. So I'm not minimizing the dangers of this disease for younger people, but if the entire population were at the same level of risk from COVID-19 as a typical 25-year-old is today, there would not be any sort of economic shutdown. There could be some public health measures taken here or there, but we would not be seeing massive worldwide disruptions because the death toll would not be 0.5%, it might be 0.01% of those infected. And that would certainly be less than your typical annual flu season. So what would it take to convince the public that combating aging is worthwhile? I think emphasizing the connection to COVID-19 and resilience against future pandemics, which is also critically important, is one of the keys here. And if we can get across to the general public that if biological senescence is reversed, the vast majority of the harm of infectious diseases will be undone, even if we don't have a vaccine. Even if we just let the virus take its course, it would take so many fewer lives if everyone in our society were restored to biological youthfulness. But on the subject of vaccines, there is a push now in the United States and in other countries throughout the world to accelerate the time frame of development of the vaccine, because there's a recognition that we cannot let these economic ramifications of the pandemic last for much longer. And it's not just a matter of lifting the lockdowns while there is still community spread of the virus. I do believe that is a necessity. but it's also a matter of alleviating public fear. Because even if the lockdown is lifted, but people are afraid of contracting the virus, they're not going to engage in a lot of the same kinds of economic activities that they used to. They may find adaptations, they should find adaptations, they should take measures to protect themselves. But ultimately, if we want to get rid of this virus, we should have a vaccine, and we need to deploy this vaccine as rapidly as possible, as long as it's shown to be generally safe. So we should not be waiting for a proof of efficacy. We should not be putting this vaccine through all of the standard rigorous clinical trials, because we don't have the time to do that. I here am in full agreement with Donald Trump and his administration that we absolutely need a vaccine before the end of this year, and we need to administer anything that shows signs of efficacy, even preliminarily, to volunteers. And by the way, there are plenty of volunteers who will be willing to take these treatments. There are plenty of people who think this is essentially a wartime situation, and they are being soldiers for the cause of fighting this virus in agreeing to take these vaccine treatments. But of course, safety is important. I just think the FDA made a horrible mistake in the early 1960s by shifting its focus from ensuring basic safety of foods and medicines, preventing adulteration, preventing fraud, which are worthwhile causes, to having this obsessive focus on efficacy, which doesn't even work half the time, but it takes billions of dollars and it creates huge barriers to entry that small-time innovators, DIY biohackers, or even conventional research scientists without billion-dollar budgets cannot overcome. So we need as many people as possible experimenting on vaccine candidates, both large companies and small-scale innovators. And in this competitive environment, the successful candidates are going to come to the forefront much more rapidly. But yes, I believe it's absolutely imperative to accelerate the pace of scientific research to combat this disease. And hopefully this will have beneficial spillover effects on being able to combat other diseases. If humankind can deploy a successful COVID-19 vaccine in 9 months, what is that going to do for vaccination research against other diseases? Perhaps we will finally have a motivation to develop a cure for the common cold or for influenza. Imagine a seasonal flu vaccine that actually works more than 60% of the time. Or imagine treatments that can actually get rid of the disease inside you once you already have it. So those are the possibilities that I see on the horizon with regard to what an effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic would look like. But we need to recognize the role that aging plays in it, and we need to push full speed ahead with any sorts of experiments, trials, and authorizations for vaccine and drug candidates. So now I want to address some of the social aspects. So we've had riots in the United States recently. We've also had peaceful protests. A lot of them were motivated by the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Derek Chauvin, who is a terrible human being. Derek Chauvin, who had no regard for human life, no regard for proportionality, and who was an example of the kind of police brutality that is pretty much confined to the United States these days. There's no other country in the Western world that has this particular kind of problem or this degree of police killings. By the way, these police killings are not confined to any particular demographic of people, any particular skin color, age, gender, etc. Others get killed too. It's just when there is racial prejudice in the mix and somebody is a bully already, that person is more likely to pull the trigger. So there is a broader problem of police brutality that we should be concerned about in the United States, and the militarization of police over the past 40 years since the start of the war on drugs and accelerating since the war on terror was being prosecuted is a serious problem. So with all that said, I don't think there would be riots in the streets right now were it not for the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic strain that it placed on people. So if you think about how people responded to prior unjust police killings of Black people in America, it was with protests. Some of the protests were violent, but most of them were largely peaceful. And I think this would have happened here as well. There would have been some protesting, but city centers in the US wouldn't have been utterly devastated the way they have been right now. And I think this isn't because of the Black Lives Matter movement. This is because of desperation and opportunism. So when there is large-scale public upheaval, some people will take advantage of that and they'll start to see what they can get away with. So they'll start breaking into stores, stealing goods because they don't see any other choice. Of course, they're wrong. And we in the USTP don't condone this kind of criminal activity. But would they have done this in the absence of the great economic pressures arising from the pandemic and the lockdowns? I don't think so. And this is something worth thinking about. It's worth saying, yes, we need to oppose police brutality. We need to push for reforms. We need to oppose racism and make sure that we don't marginalize any group of people. But on the other hand, nobody should be praising the disorder. Nobody should be seeing that as a positive, because it isn't. On both sides, it just adds fuel to the fire. If we didn't have the lockdowns, I think it would have been a lot more feasible to achieve some of the same reforms and rein in police brutality, but without the consequent toll, which has hurt a lot of Black-owned businesses, a lot of other minority-owned businesses, which has resulted in deaths of Black protesters, deaths of Black police officers like David Dorn. David Dorn was a retired 77-year-old police officer who tried to interfere on behalf of his friend, who was a store proprietor who was being attacked by looters, and the looters killed him. So I do believe that Black lives matter, and I believe that his life mattered. And I think in the United States right now, the left and the right are both to blame for being selective about which lives they think matter. And it's really important to emphasize this. We need to protect sentient rights of all beings, no matter what their superficial morphology. And we need to recognize right now we have a common enemy, we have a common cause, and we shouldn't let ourselves be divided by these wedge issues, which is what the left and the right are seeking to do. I would say these days, especially the left and the Democratic Party in the United States, they are throwing everything that they have in trying to win the 2020 election, and they don't care if they burn the country down while doing that. So we need to find a way to transcend that. We need to find a way to overcome the toxicity. We need to find a way to sit down in dialogue with everybody of all perspectives and figure out how we move forward, how we overcome our immediate problems, and then how we build a future together, a future in which there is no police brutality, there is no racism, there is no economic coercion of the kind that we saw in the wake of this pandemic, and there is no severe scarcity, no disease, no death. That is ultimately the future we need to work toward. But in order to do that, one has to get out of the trenches and one has to look upward instead. This is where I think this contrast between the SpaceX launch and the riots in the streets is so fitting for the age that we live in. If you just look up, you see all the great things that humans can accomplish. As long as you take your eyes off of the sordid activities that are happening in this toxic fight between the left and the right. So that's my assessment of world events. And I will say, as one addendum to that assessment, it is really, really important to make it through this in the short term. I think the future can be great and glorious, but we have a tense period that we are going through right now. And in the foreseeable future, the very proximate future, we're going to continue to be going through this tense period. We don't know when it's going to end, but we do know that events keep shifting week to week and even day to day. So don't let any particular event take you down. That's the most important thing. Keep at it, keep doing what you're doing, be resilient, live your life, refuse to let the toxicity seep into your life. That is the best advice that I can give to anyone watching this right now.
Well, those are very uplifting words, and they kind of reflect the background that you have there. It's a beautiful image of it's part of your virtual tour, and it's a beautiful image, and it's very nice. Wow, it's a really good summary, and I really appreciate those words, Chairman Gennady, on the tour. Yes. A lot of this is very predictable. I mean, we've talked about this over and over on the show. That's the end of Bretton Woods. That's why you're seeing global skirmishes, because America is withdrawing. And as America withdraws, these countries have their internal problems. China has massive internal problems, for example. And it's trying to ramp up nationalism in order to keep itself together, hold itself together. That's why they're going after Taiwan. That's why they're going after Hong Kong. And now, as you see, massive border skirmishes on India. It's completely predictable, and that's why, you know, if you're watching the show, you're not stressed about it at all. It's it's baked into the cake of the formalities of and structural enterprises of how these countries work. In terms of the United States, we've seen these racial conflicts, these racial epitaphs, these racial issues float up and down throughout their history, almost since the founding of the country, and pre-founding. Racial issues have been right at the heart of the United States, and it's not anything really new. The 60s was probably an era when we could point to that these issues sort of came to light and cities were on fire. Now you've got these issues in the context of regional skirmishes. You know, they're not. It's not anything particularly that America can't handle. You're talking about some sort of structural reform to the police force. You know, I find a lot of the this mass media, let's say Nos Daily, he has a huge reach, but it's not reflective of anything that I know or that you highlighted as well. In Australia, it doesn't take 6 months to be a police officer. We don't have guns and armies. In Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in South Korea, in the UK, in most of the countries around the world. You can go around the world. Maybe there's some corrupt countries or some deficient states, but you know what happens is when that media goes out there, he makes it a reflection of all police forces around the world. The Japanese police forces, for example, are known as some of the best police forces in the world. They haven't killed people in years. They've got nothing to do. They're standing around bored. And then they take people flowers and stuff. Maybe not so much now, but pre-COVID that was the thing. But those issues don't get highlighted on the global stage because they don't get clicks. They don't stir up anger. They don't stir up debates. So you know, these are American domestic issues which are promoted and highlighted on a global stage. And I find a lot of that imposition on other countries as well. Talking, you know, where Americans insert themselves into other countries' debates or other countries running how they work and how they do things and how they run things, because they don't reflect what Americans see and feel as their form of civilization. And it's somewhat sad because it's an imposition, it's an imperialization of their ideas. But it's also it's kind of laudable. It doesn't make not laudable, but it doesn't make sense because you're trying to change how we or Australians or South Koreans or Japanese people or Russians or something, how they change their police force when they don't reflect anything at all like the American police force does. But because America is such a large country, they can't really see that there are other ways of doing things, and it's kind of odd. So we end up with these reforms in other countries, and which are completely unnecessary. It's kind of a strange thing to do, but you end up having to sort of just blind yourself to these issues because it's not reflective of the global situation. I'm sure the Canadians don't have this issue, but I'm told constantly by Americans that they somehow do have this issue. So yes, I don't know. I think in Americans, in terms of their police force, probably could learn from other people around the world as opposed to trying to organically come up with new systems. Yeah, so
I'll say this, Steele, having come from one declining imperial power into another, it seems like I have some experience in observing this dynamic, but really the attitudes of some Americans are very much in parallel to the attitudes of a lot of the residents of the former Soviet Union back when it could be considered an imperial power of sorts. And there is this kind of cultural insularity, the idea that you're at the center of the world and that your own particular concerns, your own culture, your own issues of the day are the only thing that should matter. This is why, for instance, so many Americans have not learned a foreign language. They don't think they need to. They don't think that they need to make any accommodations for the rest of the world. The rest of the world should accommodate them. And what's interesting is the Americans whom I have observed to be most guilty of this tendency are, for lack of a better term, the so-called social justice warriors. They seem to be the most insular and the most ignorant of actually what other cultures are like and what is happening in other countries and what people in other countries or people from other countries, including in the non-Western world, actually believe and actually prioritize. So as you pointed out, they seem to think that their particular concerns, even though there's some justification to their concerns,
absolutely
should resonate worldwide. Yes, and the problem is they have this very stilted and quite flawed view of what diversity and multiculturalism actually mean. I would say to have a true appreciation of diversity and multiculturalism, you need to study the history of other parts of the world. You need to study the arts, the literature, the music, the fashions, and the thought patterns of people throughout time. You can't just study postmodern left-wing academics and think you somehow have this notion that everything in the world up until your critical social theory is some sort of oppressive construct that needs to be dismantled. What particularly irks me is the destruction of statues throughout the world of people who had nothing to do with slavery, who had nothing to do with oppressing Black people in any manner. But when you have an angry mob whose only idea is everything that came before is evil and corrupt and needs to be purged, and they're just indiscriminately knocking down statues.
And we've seen this. we've seen this in the Soviet Union. This was one on the first. The Marxian idea was just destroy everything, regardless of its heritage and its culture and its meaning and its construct, and that's really sad. You don't want the Khmer Rouge was the most horrible regime that ever existed. But their idea was go back to year zero and destroy everything of their own culture, regardless, including the people. And that's the sort of end point of that ideology, where it's a slash and burn strategy, so that you can start rebuilding something. And I would argue that if you want to do that, I mean, why don't you start your own seafaring civilization and go off and be sea people, please. It's kind of half a joke, it's kind of not, but it is sad. It is awful. But no, look, I disagree. As I've always said, I don't see America as a declining power. I see America as a strong, stable superpower with its problems. COVID is not really a big problem. It's something that's happened now. But I actually see America having a big youthful population that's going to have it's the country of the future in terms of its demographics. It still has all the scientists. It still has the world reserve currency, and we'll have to see what happens with that. But I don't see it, even if the world reserve, the US dollar as we know it, declines and falls away. I think that America is right in line to have the next world reserve currency equivalent. And I've never argued that can't be a thing. And it might be in union with other actors such as Canada, such as Mexico, arguably maybe the United Kingdom and Australia. Because it needs more constituent parts to hold a new currency system. I've never said that that's not an issue, but I don't see anywhere else in the world that has the structural capacity of the United States, its scientific endeavor, its institutional structures, including its justice system, its political system, with the Congress and the Senate, and its three branches, the executive, the judicial, and the other one. I don't see any.
The legislative branch.
The legislative council. I don't see any other countries with this structural integrity, with this youthful dynamic, with this scientific power. With its hands on both Spanish, which is the new global language, and English, which is the new global language, plus a very big dynamic resource base sitting underneath you, whether that be oil, gold, all of the rare earth minerals, and its alliance structure globally, with all of the information and knowledge capabilities, including companies like Facebook, companies like Twitter, and Google, and others. I do not see America going anywhere as a superpower. It's not that America is in decline. It's in transition, and that's what I've always worried about. But even like I've always said, with America could go through a French-style revolution, like the French did, or like a lot of countries in Europe have done. They go through a revolution. There's a lot of issues and problems with revolution, and they come out on the other side as a different entity, but that's stronger. That's now stronger. It has a purpose, and I think the freedom that's been embedded into the structural integrity of America is actually a very important facet, especially heading into the digital age, because I don't see what China's doing is China is centralizing everything, putting everybody on a social credit system, on every sort of credit system that you can see, and to me, that is a sign of weakness. That's a sign that you can't trust your population, that your population could implode, and that you need to track and tag everybody in a sort of high-tech digital gulag, so that you can manage a decline. When you trust your population with the freedom aspect, and the freedom aspect has been lost, and we could talk to plenty of people, including WikiLeaks, all the WikiLeaks people, or Kristen Conklin, or we could talk to others about freedom being lost in America, but freedom is still there as a subtext, which is not in other countries. And I think that freedom of the individual actor, which will actually help in the biotech revolution, which is something that has disgustingly been lost in the freedom notion, but I think will come back at some point, is something that's inherent in the American psyche. And I think this is perfect for the next wave of revolution, whether that be in space, whether that be in biotech, information technology, the economy, etc. And it's not a declining power. Maybe it's declining out of one of its phases. Sure, it's declining out of the Bretton Woods type phase of having a global currency, having an import only based economy, even though it's not structurally reliant on imports from China or from anywhere else in the world. It's very self-reliant, and we've been over that on economic shows here on Detonation. But it's declining out of a phase and it's entering a new phase, and you always see periods of unrest, of civil strife, of or whatever in those phases. And on the other side, we're going to see a technological boom with a new invigorated United States. And one of the reasons that I was hoping, and I think everybody was hoping, that the big machinery of American ingenuity, science, technology industry was going to gear up around COVID and was going to really move as a big mechanism like the United States can do. Didn't happen. Is I think it's just those structural issues, those issues in America right now, which it's just sorting out, and it's just sorting those out. And I think it's like a washing machine. Everything's got to go round and round and round until it all comes out in the wash. So we're watching that happen, but it's not a declining power in terms of the world stage. It's a country that's sorting itself out. But the thing is, I wouldn't want I didn't support Bernie Sanders. I don't want to see a Bernie Sanders type revolution. I understand a lot of the issues of the working class, and that's why we talk about UBI, because UBI is a better Andrew Yang is better. He's better than Bernie Sanders on almost every issue. On almost every issue, he understands the issues of the United States working class better than Bernie Sanders does, because Andrew Yang didn't have an agenda to flick the country from one mode, which is the United States with its constitution, and it's to another mode, a more socialist, more collectivist mode. Andrew Yang was saying there are structural problems with the advancement of technology. There are structural problems with the advance with our freedom, with all the issues that Andrew Yang went on about, and he understands the actual structural inefficiencies, and he tried to address those structural inefficiencies. Whereas I think Bernie Sanders, for me, was pandering to emotional, just like Donald Trump. He's pandering to emotional cries of a declining period of the American empire. And I think he would have dramatically changed the nature of what it means to be an American. And I don't, that's why I was never excited by him, so to speak. Right. But Andrew Yang, for me, is a structural engineer. He's an engineer, and he understands actually how to assist the transition out of what America is right now into the new America, which I think, talking to Peter Zing yesterday, but we're going to have more shows on this. Like you're saying, we're launching rockets at the same time we're having riots. How is that happening? And it's happening because America is a big, dynamic, strong country that isn't a declining power, but it's a power in transition.
Well, I think it's really quite interesting to contrast Sanders and Yang, because I agree, Bernie Sanders did not really have any innovative solutions to the problems that his constituents faced. His solutions were the same old bash the billionaires and tax the rich mentality. The fact is, the rich do not own enough resources to actually alleviate these problems. The only way you persistently alleviate poverty and scarcity is through production. And the only way you sustainably ramp up production is through technological innovation. And one important aspect to keep in mind, Bernie Sanders was opposed to a universal basic income. He criticized Andrew Yang when Andrew Yang proposed it. On the other hand, the U.S. Transhumanist Party had been at the forefront of the UBI discussion since Zoltan Istvan ran for president. The federal land dividend is Zoltan Istvan's brainchild. The idea that you lease out the vast swaths of unoccupied federal land to private companies, and you use that to provide a minimum income floor below which people cannot fall.
Can I just say on that point? I was talking with Peter about UBI yesterday, and I didn't mention it because we went on, but I got to mention it now just quickly and hold that thought there, Chairman. But the reason that the UBI is a better, more efficient method than a lot of the socialist payment, this one, tiers of people, classes of people, is because what they're trying to do when they set up those arbitrary income statements and say you are entitled to X amount or whatever, is there's two structural problems with that. The first structural problem is that you're creating bureaucratic masses so they're creating artificial jobs out of the government pay the purse to bureaucratically manage all of these different payments. So they're creating artificial jobs. So firstly, they say, oh, we've created 100,000 jobs in Connecticut or in Omaha or wherever or around the country to manage the different payment methods. So you've got artificial jobs created, which are a suction, but then also managing all the different payments are so complicated and so burdensome that they usually end up creating complexities within the system. And we've seen this with Obamacare, we've seen this with the healthcare forever. The complexities are the problem, and that's why these issues are always bad, because the people want those jobs, but they know that those jobs are just passing around paper trying to fix up minor issues within footprints, on notes, on this and this. The reason that the UBI is better, and the reason that the billionaire getting $1,000 a month is not unfair, is because the cost of that bureaucracy has dropped to almost near zero. So you don't have to pay 100,000 people to throw paperwork around and to have hundreds of fraud cases, and you didn't declare your income and you put it overseas and you did this and you did this, which is a whole burden on the state. This is a simple payment that can almost drop the bureaucratic cost down to zero, which means that people now have income to pay for rent, pay for food. It goes almost straight back out into the economy. If they want to send the money overseas, that's fine. It's going to get taxed on the way out anyway, but you have to find some way to live. So this is why the UBI debate just demolishes any of these other arguments that they have, because it's the people who are voting for these other arguments want to be the bureaucrats in the buildings, sitting around, shuffling paperwork to each other and going to courts all day, every day.
Yes, you're absolutely right on this point, Steele. I think it's the conditionality of conventional welfare systems that has resulted in their utter failure, and yet there's a strong constituency, particularly in Democratic Party circles, to maintain that conditionality, which is why Andrew Yang never really had a chance running within the Democratic Party. Had he run as a pure independent, I think his chances would have actually been much stronger, and he could have remained in the race during the post-COVID time. Imagine Yang competing against both Biden and Trump. That would definitely shift some perspectives. Now, on UBI, I also think it's important to emphasize, had a universal basic income been in place immediately at the onset of the pandemic, we would not have had the riots right now. People would have stayed home and they would have enjoyed their basic income, and they would have tried to protect themselves from the spread of the virus. I think one reason why people are rioting right now is this desperation, the idea that they've been pushed to the brink and they don't see any good alternatives. So they might as well go out into the streets where they are in crowds and their risk of contracting COVID-19 greatly increases. And some of them think they're doing this for a noble cause, but Some of them are there because they see an opportunity. Unfortunately, it's a very, let's say, sordid kind of motivation. But it's often said civilization is 9 square meals away from complete collapse, because once people start feeling the hunger, a lot of the civilized inhibitions, this veneer of civility and peacefulness that many people manage to pull off in their day-to-day lives disappears, because there are just these basic pressures at the very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that's exactly what we need to avoid. I have been saying in late March, early April, look at Italy. Look at the fact that the Italians stopped singing out of their balconies and started being worried about the mob taking over large segments of the country in the wake of these lockdowns. And I forecast in late April, we're about a month away from this kind of situation in the United States. And in late May, what happened? These major riots. Without COVID-19, or without the lockdowns, or with the lockdowns, but with a universal basic income as the cushion, none of this destruction would have happened. And again, even if George Floyd had been killed, there would have been an uproar. There would have been discussions about reform, some peaceful protests somewhere, and that would have been the extent of it, I think. So it's really important also to consider how these events influence one another. And I think one big failing of the United States right now is how it has been hijacked by the two-party system. Now, I believe America is a great country, and the founding ideals of America are great. They were profoundly transformational for their time. This whole idea that you have a country that's not founded on ethnicity or race or ancestry, that's not founded on the right of some people essentially to be booted and spurred to ride others, as Thomas Jefferson put it, but rather in Jefferson's ideal, a natural aristocracy of talent and virtue. That's what he believed would rise to the forefront. And you mentioned the Constitution, you mentioned checks and balances, you mentioned limited government. All of these are innovations that the American founders definitely found some theoretical basis in earlier societies for, but they developed them to an unprecedented extent. But what has happened is a set of extra constitutional mechanisms and institutions took over this society and parasitized off of it for a long time. Particularly the two-party system, the Democratic and Republican parties, have polarized the American society so that approximately 50% of the population utterly despise approximately the other 50%. And this was a toxic dynamic that was not intended at any stage of the process until very recently. So I don't think Richard Nixon intended to turn his Republican constituents against anybody who ever voted Democratic, for instance. I don't think Jimmy Carter intended to turn his Democratic constituents against anyone who ever voted Republican. And if you listen to the rhetoric of those presidents, as controversial as they may have been at times, they tried to be more unifying influences. You don't hear that from Donald Trump, and you certainly don't hear that from any of his Democratic rivals. So what happened? I think it's this downward spiraling dynamic that sets in whenever you have this us versus them mentality and you have forces that profit from it. And the forces that profit from it are media and political consultants. I single out those groups as the most destructive in American society today. The mainstream media profits off of sensationalism, the if it bleeds, it leads principle. And they also use it very cleverly to suppress alternatives, to de-emphasize channels where people can have civilized, nonpartisan or transpartisan discourse, to pressure social media companies to shut down independent reporting outlets. For instance, Ford Fisher is a friend of mine. He runs News to Share with the two. And he goes out, he films actual sites of protests. He films major public events. He tells you what's happening on the ground. And there have been so many instances when the mainstream media have lobbied for Facebook and other social media platforms to essentially ban his reporting, which is unconscionable. Then there is the fact that we had an open presidential debate on March 4th in Chicago with 18 candidates from 8 different political parties, including Joe Jorgensen, who is now the Libertarian Party nominee. And what media outlets covered it? Only the independent press covered it. We have the full debate on YouTube at the Free and Equal Elections Foundation site, but there were no reporters from ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox. None of them were interested in this, despite the fact that this was the biggest debate of the election season. Nothing even came close. And Steele, you and I co-hosted a debate on March 15th, 2020, with some prominent candidates, including Spike Cohen, who is now the Libertarian VP. Did the mainstream media cover that? No, it did not. So it's
so big, and there's so many ideas, so many people out there that video cameras themselves have exposed what you're talking about, because people are walking around and filming, and now you can, because of the magic of YouTube or the internet, you can see our perspective from somebody's phone, but then you can see how it's reported by the legacy media, and then you can make up your own mind. And Trump, arguably he led the charge on the fake news thing, but it did open up a huge debate in the society about what is fake news, what is sensationalism, how are they using it, and it came right at the right time when really everybody started to get video cameras and phones and things, and your 2 or 3 examples there of a huge a political debate from various parties with various candidates completely ignored, while they have news anchors complaining that Trump, Hillary, Bernie, or some of these other candidates, Joe Biden, soak up all the attention. But hang on, that's because there's a loop. They complain about it, then they feed you back to the same people, and then they do that, and they do that, and they do that. It's an infinite loop, while they be hypocrites and ignore actual political debates. It's terrible, it's horrible, but the people in general, they see through it, and the United States Transhumanist Party will continue to be part of these debates, even if they're only covered by independent media. People like Kriston Harris, Brett Nally, and others, Rowan Horn, and others on that side of things. There's a lot of alternative media out there, but it's not the problem. The problem with independent media is it's not authentic in the same way as the legacy media is. The legacy media is much better at, if they say it, okay, people might be skeptical, but they also have to believe it because they have the resources to cover the things that independent media can't. And for example, the real propaganda pulls in when, let's say, a hurricane comes in. That's when the legacy media really pulls away, because let's say we have a channel out there on YouTube and it can only cover one thing because it's one person doing one thing, and they do that thing really well, whatever that thing might be. Pick a subject, space, or independent political parties, or whatever, and they do that really well. But do they also do the weather, and do they also do when the hurricane's coming in and they go and save the people and do the theatrics and do all that? They can't do that. And that's why when the legacy media says you got to watch out for this hurricane and bunker down, suddenly you're hit by a storm, and then you have, because if you ignored that and you didn't prepare because you said, I don't trust the media, and the ABC News told you to do that, then you're going to be negatively impacted in your life. And that's how they get you, because then they feed you back to those politicians who they want you to say that. And that is the propaganda matrix. Whereas these other people are not believed. So the free and equal debate is not really believed as much because it's not on ABC, it's not on NBC, it's not on MSNBC, it's not on Fox, it's not on CNN, right? And that's where they really pull away using those resources to authenticate themselves and entrench themselves in a circular system, where they get money, they get sponsors, then they feed those back to politicians, and around the circle goes. And they've now worked that out even in the age of the internet. And they because everyone thought that the mainstream media was going to implode and die because of the internet, but actually the reverse is happening. The mainstream media it's survived, and they're starting to work out how to use the internet and how to beat out all these different little competitors in this information war. Alex Jones being kicked off YouTube, for example, was one of the big test cases. And, you know, whether or not you like Alex Jones, I don't care. I don't care what you think. That's not my problem, my issue. But the fact that they could launch an attack on him and his ideas and his way of presenting and really kind of silence him in that arena is a really big test case of how far they can push in this new information warfare debate. And it's a really interesting thing. And it's sad because, for example, the free and equal debate was censored, essentially, by them not turning up and being offered to turn up and them knowing about it, and by omitting that from the news cycle. And instead, when you turn on Fox in the morning, they're talking about kittens and cats and the new greatest bathtub for your cat. That is propaganda emission. That's what that is. So it is there. It's real. It's censorship, and it's censorship via emission, and it's sad, but it's the world you have to work with, and it's why you have to support or watch independent people, and you have to be always skeptical about what's being presented and what's obviously that's not obvious thing, but you have to be skeptical about what's being presented, especially on both sides of the coin, on everything you hear and read, and you have to try and plug into good sources. And I would recommend going to Brett Nowley's channel, for example. They've launched a brand new channel, Longevity. It's fantastic. I mean, this is Ira Pasta, great stuff. Really, really good stuff. A lot of great people out there. Kriston Harris doing a great work out there. But yes, always be skeptical about what you're being presented in this information war. They are fighting back, and they've learned to fight back. It's entrenched now. They've won the war.
Well, it's interesting because I think they were losing the war up until 2015.
Yeah,
when Donald Trump announced his candidacy. So Les Moonves, who was the CEO of CBS, he was one of the people who was toppled rightfully during the Me Too movement. But prior to that, he made a statement essentially saying Donald Trump is really bad for the country, but he's really good for CBS because he attracted a lot of attention. People couldn't stop watching Donald Trump's inflammatory statements because the media were amplifying his statements, and the media were either pretending to be horrified or genuinely horrified at his statements, but they were rebroadcasting them. So Donald Trump got a lot of free publicity by doing this. But what the mainstream media got in exchange was this viewership that was obsessively glued to it, just as it would have been glued to it during a natural disaster. But the thing with natural disasters is that they're temporary. A hurricane comes through an area, causes devastation, and then there's a long rebuilding process, but the news cycle moves on. And that's the same with an earthquake or a wildfire or a tsunami or any other short-term physical disaster that one could think of. But what has happened since 2015 was that the mainstream media have figured out not just how to gain people's attention, but how, in my view, to exacerbate crises that may have had other origins, but to prompt a public reaction that would always be in the direction of escalation and polarization. So, for instance, with Donald Trump, the way to defeat him would have been essentially a solid front of the civilized center against him, the never Trump Republicans teaming up with the Democrats, and then Trump would have lost the election resoundingly. But what did the Democrats do? They picked the most polarizing candidate they absolutely could, with Hillary Clinton, because it was her turn to be in power, according to the Democratic National Committee type of thinking. And then what did they do after Trump got elected? Instead of calling for decency, civility, respectability, the left amped up the toxicity to the extent that it outdid Trump, essentially. And at this point, Trump is the one who is often calling for peace and de-escalation, as strange as it might have seemed 4 years ago. So we see this spiral. And it's not exclusively a problem of the left. It's not exclusively a problem of the right. It's a problem of this perverse incentive system that amplifies its own depredations. And this is also where the political consultants come in. So the political consultant's job is to give advice to potential candidates or to political parties. And in order to give effective advice, they have an incentive to segment the public into tidy demographics. So they actually want all Black voters to think in similar ways. They want all women to think in similar ways. They want everyone who is left-leaning to have the same stances on issues like abortion should be legalized, or whether evolution should be taught in the schools, even though those two have no relation to one another. And there's no necessary connection between what one's stance on abortion is and what one's stance on evolution is. But these parties, through accidents of history, have assembled certain voting blocks where there's a certain statistical tendency for people to favor certain sides of an issue versus others. And a lot of these issues don't affect individuals at all in most people's daily lives. For instance, the abortion issue is a classic wedge issue. Most people are never going to come into contact with a real life situation where abortion is even a question. And yet it's one of the most polarized issues in contemporary American society. And people end up having vicious spats over it, even though neither side of the argument is personally affected in any manner. So why does that happen? Because there are very well-moneyed and strategically Machiavellian apparatuses working to get people riled up on these issues. And that's the tragedy of contemporary American politics. I think if people sit down one-on-one and try to have a civilized conversation, including with someone who has completely different political views and priorities, that would be possible. But people are hearing messages from very polished and well-connected and influential sources saying, no, you should hate the other side. You should be enraged. You should go out into the streets and break things. And is it any surprise that a lot of people who don't have critical thinking skills, who haven't been educated to have critical thinking skills, are doing exactly this, and they're turning on the people in their lives, they're turning on their friends, they're turning on their neighbors, they're destroying their communities because media and political pundits told them to. That's the tragedy of America right now. And that is undermining America's founding principles. It's undermining America's stature in the world. But I will say this, I don't think America will collapse tomorrow, but I do worry about a long Roman Empire style decline. And let's bring the Antonine Plague into this, because the Roman Empire was at its zenith in the 2nd century, prior to the Antonine Plague. It actually had some of its best rulers, especially Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, who were genuine civic-minded, philosophical individuals who wanted to benefit the people. The Antonine Plague wiped out about 2 million inhabitants of the Roman world, which was absolutely devastating at that time. But what a lot of people also don't realize is it killed the two co-emperors of Rome, not in immediate succession, but it killed Lucius Verus in 169 and it killed Marcus Aurelius in 181. After Marcus Aurelius died, his son Commodus, who was an absolute degenerate, became the Roman emperor. And things just went downhill from there because Commodus, he was cruel, capricious, murderous, etc. He got killed by the Praetorian Guard, as often happened to bad Roman emperors. And then that set off essentially a period of time where for the vast majority of the 3rd century, Rome did not have a stable system of governance. Generals and politicians were essentially seizing the throne left and right, brutally murdering their opponents. In the meantime, the empire fell into chaos. And there were aborted attempts every now and then to revive it. So Septimius Severus tried to do it, Diocletian tried to do it, Constantine tried to do it, Theodosius tried to do it. They all made terrible mistakes when they tried to do it, but to some extent, just rallying the empire together helped avert total collapse for a while. And then, of course, the Byzantines tried to do it in the eastern half for over 1,000 years until 1453. But sometimes you have this sequence of events that amplifies itself, that turns a virtuous cycle into a vicious cycle. And then struggling against that is a kind of Sisyphean labor, if you would. And that's what I'm concerned about with the United States, that COVID-19 may be our Antonine plague unless we emphasize the progress of technology. What we have now that the Romans didn't is rapid technological innovation. The Romans were pretty advanced for their time, especially compared to the barbarian kingdoms that followed. But they didn't have the ability to develop a vaccine in less than a year. So my hope is, while we're going to see these negative events essentially amplify one another, if the positive developments, the technological breakthroughs, the innovative arrangements in response to these problems are able to outpace the negative developments, that's where we have a fighting chance. But this is where humankind really needs to get its act together right now and reject this polarization, reject this toxicity, focus everything we have on the fight against death and disease, because this is really going to matter. We need to turn the situation around, lest we have another Antonine plague. We do not want to relive the long decline of the Roman Empire.
Yes, that's true. But we also survived the Spanish influenza. So there's other parallels in history where events don't necessarily. I mean, you're talking about a very long period of time and a lot of different events. And yeah, it's a good point. It's a really good point. And I just wanted to go back to this media thing just for 1 second to emphasize that what we're talking about with the media, it's being emphasized a lot, on different shows, and so I don't want to go on about it too much. But what you're saying in terms of a sort of parasitical entity or having too much influence. I mean, Trump, especially when it mattered, used to retweet Murdoch's tweets a lot, and I used to follow that. And as an Australian, I don't really have a problem with that, but as a concerned human, that's actually pretty bad. But I'd like to just remind people that Morgan Ortagus, she is the spokesperson for the State Department, and she's a Fox News person, and also that you now have the White House press secretary, this woman here, Kayleigh McEnany. She's the White House press secretary, and she's just a Fox News anchor, basically. So you can see that the coalition of forces has come full circle to the point where there is now no distinction between the government and the press, or the government and a specific news entity, one of these big six corporations that control the news. They are essentially incestuous now. There's no freedom of press, which is it's interesting for me as someone who likes international relations, because if you start talking about Iran or Iraq or some Middle Eastern country, one of the big issues of going over there, people say generically freedom, but actually in the fine print they talk about press freedom, freedom of press. But when the press or the media moguls are making up policy dictates, I don't know if that's press freedom. I don't know what the definition of that is, but that's it's incestuous and it's wrong, because they're there as another check and balance against. So you have those separation of powers, and you have those institutional structures to keep the people owning the government and keep the government in a check within itself. But also the press is supposed to be there as an external overwatch. It's supposed to overwatch society and the government and keep everyone in check from the external. By creating this incestuous relationship, you lose that overwatch, and it becomes a breeding ground for essentially corruption. And I can't go into what that corruption is, but structurally, it's a breeding ground for corruption, because now you get a breakdown of those checks and balances. And the biggest one of all, which is supposed to be the press, that overwatch, that a lot of presidents have said that the printing press or the internet or books or the press itself is the conscience of human deeds. And when you lose your conscience to structural inefficiencies like that, you set yourself up for a fall. And I think the American population is awake to this, so I don't think this will go on for too long. I said, as an Australian, it doesn't bother me too much, but as a concerned human, actually, it's very, very, very awful. So yes, and we did have a comment down here saying, I think we also need to stop letting groups like the Democrats, for example, keeping us angry and profiteering off situations. We need to stop letting them feed off our anger. And yes, Mike, I am sick. I don't think it's COVID sick. I have had problems, just problems, but it's all right. We're back on the show. I'm self-isolating, and Gennady is a fair distance away from me, so he's not going to catch whatever I got. So we're okay.
Well, I'm here in the remote future. This is Robert McCall's painting, The Apotheosis of Technology, in the background. So that's where I want to be, Steele. That's the kind of world that I want to inhabit right now, and I think we should all strive for. But I will say you're absolutely right about the revolving door between the media and government. Yes, an independent press, a truly independent press that is a check on institutions of power, could be wonderful. And we have occasional truly independent journalists. I would say Julian Assange was such an example. Edward Snowden was such an example. Glenn Greenwald is such an example. But they get suppressed by this system, which really isn't serving the purpose of information dissemination so much anymore as it serves the purpose of propaganda. If you want to find raw information about world events, it's possible to do that without tuning into cable news or even looking at your Google News feed. The Google News feed has increasingly become algorithmically curated to the point of really being propaganda. And I'm very disappointed in that, as someone who has had a tendency to check Google News several times a day, because I thought it would give me a sufficient diversity of sources that I could ferret out the truth between reading the left-leaning sites and the right-leaning sites and the Reuters or AP types of publications, and kind of discerning what were some of the common elements. But when you have the media in lockstep with a particular political faction, as is happening right now, you get a comprehensively distorted view of the truth. And especially
and it's sad. It's sad that people abused, and I'm not sure whether or not. And I'm for clicks. It's sad that people have abused the magnificence of something like Facebook or Twitter, where they set up these fake news accounts, news websites, and they put the clickbait up there, and they release fake information, whether that be medical information or fake news or whatever. They've abused the internet to the point where Facebook or Twitter is very reluctant to share anything. I mean, and you can see the corner built in by themselves, or what they've been pushed into, or whatever, that Facebook and Twitter are in. Because if they share something that turns out to be fake and it goes viral, they get in trouble for sharing it because it's gone viral and it's turned out to be wrong, and people are getting hurt by this information. But at the same time, if it turns out that was true, and they're a little website that's trying to push out the truth, and they shut it down because they're not sure, therefore they get in trouble for suppressing, and they're pushed into this corner of what do we do. And that's why you can see they try and steer away from the whole, because in the early days of Facebook and Twitter, it was just content. It was just everything, right. everything, try and dominate the market. And now they're reluctant to do whatever. And society has essentially pushed ourselves by this quick grasp for, I don't know, whether it was a commercial gain or a joke or whatever it was. And we've kind of ruined these platforms so that the algorithms have got stronger towards traditional and legacy news media, because in a world of all of this information, arguably they are slightly better. At least they've been fact checked, and they have spelling check, and they have the names right, and you know what I mean? Like it is arguably better, and the medical advice isn't going to be harmful to you. It's going to say go to your doctor. It's not going to say this will cure aging if you just take this pill and it's going to reverse your age. There's stuff like that all over the internet, and humanity itself, by playing with these powerful tools of information sharing, has pushed ourselves and these CEOs into a corner. Whether or not they like that, maybe that's good for them, but they've increasingly algorithmically pushed ourselves into a corner, and we've done it to ourselves in an Orwellian type way, where we've caged ourselves up, unfortunately, most people don't have the skills to navigate the external internet, or the ambition, or the ability, or the ambition, because it's much easier just to scroll through a Facebook feed or a Twitter feed and say that's my information, then go out and do proper research and sign up to Britannica and read Britannica, or if you're very lazy, go and read Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a semi-fine resource. I don't read it for many reasons. I've never read it. I would much rather read an encyclopedia on an issue, but Wikipedia does at least try. It tries diligently to have sufficient, kind of good information, but I wouldn't trust it as much. And for me personally, I've always said, I would either read something that's been checked and rechecked by scholars, for example, Britannica or other encyclopedias, than something that can be edited on the internet like Wikipedia. But if you are looking for just broad information on something, maybe the dates are wrong, maybe the information is wrong, but you can use that as a platform to launch and actually do research. But a lot of these algorithms have pushed us into a corner we've half made ourselves, and it's half the nature of the internet. And it's sad. It's very sad. And also the definitions of journalists has been changed radically. So when I mention Edward Snowden, people are divided on the issue of whether he's a journalist or whether he's an online spy, hacker, fugitive. People don't know the definition of what he is, or Edward Snowden, or any of these other Glenn Greenwald, like you mentioned. People aren't clear on the definition, because a lot of the reporters themselves, who are supposed to be reporting the news, who toe the party line or the government line, will themselves call them a fugitive or call them an enemy of the state in order to protect themselves, saying we don't do that sort of journalism because that's not real journalism, because they didn't get it from our incestuous friends. So that's that's part of the self-preservation mechanism in there. Anyway, look, Chairman, I don't want to keep you here all day. You've done a fantastic job of talking, helping. We're going to have a great time on the Archer Report in the coming months. Thank you for highlighting the innovations in the USTP. Remember, everybody, you have to go and check out the USTP and the United States Transhumanist Party, and check out the new Charlie Cam. He there's interviews on Detonation about that. He's a really cool dude. Lots with cryonics, longevity. Go and check out his I'm a very model of a singularitarian. His music, it's very interesting. You'll learn a lot about the singularity and about longevity in that one, but also he's also done some short films on death and disease and how to overcome them and how to cure them. It's very interesting, and he's a very funny guy, very relaxed, and very powerful. He's a powerful speaker. So check him out. Check out all the new updates over there. Thanks to Thrivous, thanks to our new companies that are sponsoring us, and I'll get better, and we're going to have a great time on the Archer Report. I'm back. Thanks to everybody who kept it alive. I've got it's all set up here, as you can see. Got a white background. It's super exciting, but we're going to press on, and we're going to try and navigate into the next paradigm, because I think this COVID event is going to see a paradigm shift. If you look at, like we were saying yesterday on the show, if you look at the types of jobs that have disappeared and the types of jobs that are being created, it's all technology-based jobs. It's even though there's a decline in globalization, that doesn't mean anything, because those jobs will be replicated in technology in your own country. Which means huge investments in technological growth and infrastructure in the future. And I think we are looking at a massively different society technologically out of this, in the positive. I don't see how we can walk back from this. We were walking into a hybrid model. I think now we are walking into a technology model, and it's the only way forward. Both from the state perspective, innovations, because of COVID, because everyone's at home, we're going to be fixing up the suburbs, greater communication technologies, all sorts of things. But also in the cities, I think there's going to be huge, massive innovation. I want to go through more of those, and instead of, even in simple things like garden parks, green parks, self-sustaining, more localized structures of food. It's going to be massive. It's going to be big. So we want to talk about all of that coming up, because I think there's a huge shift coming, and I think it's already partly here. But especially in longevity, I think it's taking off, Chairman. I really think longevity is starting to really, really take off. People have woken up to the health implications, and if you were a restaurateur in 2018, and you never thought about longevity in your life, you never thought about biosecurity in your life, by 2020, you're an expert on at least the social and economic implications of what happens when you don't have these structures and facilities set up, because you are now sitting at home, or you've lost your business, or you've lost employers, or you've lost patrons, or whatever. And it's not your fault. It's an external, quote unquote, invisible enemy that hasn't been buffered against and hasn't been structurally buffered against, which has been devastating to you and your community. So, we've been talking about it, why you need to set up against this sort of stuff, and why it's important, but now everybody's talking about it, and they're actually doing stuff about it. And this isn't just in one aspect. It's not just in biosecurity. It's not just in curing COVID. This is going to be a massive implementation of protecting health of humans globally for a long time to come, so that we don't have more shocks to our economic, social structures, because people are realizing the fragility of allowing those structures to even shake. And what we live in right now, is a it's not capitalist, but it's a capitalist type model that's designated on growth. And and you have to grow to sustain yourself and your models and your systems. And people are worried about a 1, 2, 3% contraction, and look at the amount of instability that you can generate from a 1, 2, 3% contraction. And people are worried about that, and people can't fathom a 10%, 20%, 30% contraction. That sounds like the end of humanity as we know it. So no, they're really thinking about this, and I think they will turn, and they have been, and that's what we're seeing. It's technological-based solutions, national technological-based solutions in manufacturing, in health, in social security, which would be UBI. That's the simplest way to do it. In your environment, in your space based systems, in your information and communication systems, in your IT infrastructure, which we're seeing more of now with cyber hacks and cybersecurity becoming a more and more part of warfare and generic individual sovereignty and individual security. And we've talked to McAfee about that, and many other factors as well, and many other factors, including the big factor which is coming down the road, which is depending on the COVID, which is elderly care. Elderly care is a huge one. It's a huge challenge which we all have to get ready for. Elderly care, because the amount of older population is about to tilt the world into a new crisis of this. But anyway, thank you so much, Chairman.
All right, thank you, Steele. It was a pleasure speaking with you this evening, and I appreciate the thoughtful conversation. I would encourage all of you watching to keep returning to the Archer Report and Detonation. I think you're right, Steele. We're going to have plenty of fascinating developments to discuss. The pace of change has definitely accelerated and continues to accelerate. The U.S. Transhumanist Party is going to serve as a bulwark of sanity, rationality, respectability in these difficult times. We want to navigate through all of the problems toward a brighter future, and we're not going to let these crises of our day, as difficult as they are, stop us from doing that. I'm completely committed to making sure we make it out the other end better and stronger than before. And if I mention the Antonine Plague, if I mention the prospects of regression, it's because I think we can fight against it. And I think we can prevent it and lead to the bright future that you were discussing, Steele.
Yeah, in the Antonine Plague, it's exactly like you said. There's different prospects now because of technology, because we could perhaps have a vaccine, which wasn't possible. You had to navigate those challenges right up to the emperors who died from that plague. Everyone was vulnerable. This is the case right now, as far as we know. There is no vaccine, which means Trump and all the heads of state everywhere are vulnerable to it, which is why you're seeing the reactions that they are. But that's not baking the cake. In fact, vaccines look possible, and the whole world is working on it right now. So that is a collective action. You just the international scene, that's a breakdown of Bretton Woods, and the domestic scene in America, that's mostly wealth and racial and social inequality bubbling up and fueling up. And we'll see what happens on the other side of that. But America has proven over and over and over again, right back to the Civil War, which was devastating, but it turned out to be not a blimp, but an action that led to a bigger, better, greater, more prosperous country. And we've seen that over and over in history. So I wouldn't despair in that way. All right. Well, thank you, Chairman. We will see you again very soon, and we're going to see everybody else on as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Oh, and also check out TAF's TAFS is a very important organization as well. They are doing very, very well, and a lot of different Zoom conferences and stuff. So make sure you check out TAFS. Oshinakachi is doing a great job. So thank you very much. We're going to have a debrief with Oshinakachi about his conferences soon. So thank you very much.